The journalists and experts who work for mainstream and prestigious organizations insist on treating us like a ship and presenting cartoonish analyses, let's say. I mean, isn't it funny that we here on YouTube, on Syriana Analysis, we present to you a better geopolitical content than a lot of mainstream media outlets and experts that we can see them day and night on TV channels. I think that is not a coincidence, because if they tell the people the truth why the United States, Russia, and other powers are fighting over Ukraine, a lot of people will realize that the United States in the past years was provoking Russia in eastern Ukraine and in general in Eastern Europe. And when Russia attacked Ukraine, the United States is now using the Ukrainians as cannon fodders in order to reach its geopolitical goals there, in a war that Ukrainians have very little chance of victory or winning. That is why the mainstream media or the mainstream journalists and experts, let's say, they are always trying nowadays to keep the people alarmed against, of course, Russia and other powers such as China. And they want to present an argument or analysis claiming that this war in Ukraine is about democracy, or the so-called American democracy and the democratic allies of the United States and the American freedoms, etc. In my opinion, if you go to any country now that the United States calls them enemies or foes, such as Russia, China, Iran, Syria, and you pick randomly 1,000 people from each country and ask them about their opinion on the American freedoms or the American way of life. I mean, literally no one cares about how the Americans live in the United States or what the American freedoms are. They just want to be left alone. Now, I was reading an article on Bloomberg, and that is why I'm making this introduction. This article is written by Hal Brand, a professor of global affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Now, the title of the article is Ukraine War is Depleting America's Arsenal of Democracy. According to Brand, the United States is following an arsenal of democracy strategy in Ukraine. It has avoided direct intervention against the Russian invaders while working with allies and partners to provide the Kiev government with money and guns. The strategy, reminiscent of US support for Britain in 1940-41, has worked wonders. Yet as the war reaches a critical stage, with the Russians preparing to consolidate their grip on eastern Ukraine, the arsenal of democracy is being depleted. That could cause a fatal shortfall for Ukrainian forces in this conflict, and it is revealing American weaknesses that could be laid bare in the next great power fight. Now, I have 3 comments on this analysis or arguments of Brand. First is, Brand, by writing this, he confirms our argument that the United States is actually fighting Russia in Ukraine indirectly, and by sending weapons, the Americans are practically using the Ukrainians as cannon fodders for the sake of geopolitical gains for Washington, whereas Ukrainians gain very little. The second comment is, comparing the current war in Ukraine with World War II is quite bizarre, because back then the Allies, including the Soviet Russia, were fighting hand in hand against one enemy, and that was Nazi Germany, whose remnants today form the Azov Battalion, the S-14, the National Militia, etc. Those who participated in the Holocaust against the Jews, they are the same ones of this Azov, S-14, National Militia, etc. that the media nowadays is trying to whitewash these Nazi groups, just like they did in Syria with these so-called rebels. And even Al-Nusra Front, which is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, they even tried to whitewash Al-Qaeda and say, no, they're now moderate rebels, right? So they're doing the same in Ukraine. They're just playing the same playbook. Today, these same Nazis who attacked Russia and much of Europe during World War II have found themselves, these Nazis found themselves in the same trench with their former enemies. This is another observation. The third comment is, while calling for delivery of more weapons to Ukraine to foster the strength of the United States, as Brand argued, he, the author Brand, doesn't mention the interests of Ukraine. Where is the interest of Ukraine in this? He's only talking about the United States. So this also proves our warning that the United States doesn't care about Ukraine and doesn't care if Ukrainians die and doesn't care if the infrastructure is destroyed. They truly care about their geopolitical interests, and they are using the Ukrainians in order to achieve these goals. So for Washington policymakers, the loss of Ukraine is the beginning of the end of America's hegemony, let's say, over the world, right? So while they don't want to intervene directly in Ukraine because it will cause World War III, but they are ready to fight till the last man in Ukraine in order to defeat Russia. Is this logical? Can they defeat really Russia, the Ukrainians? Are they able to defeat Russia? This is very unlikely. So what's the alternative? If they can't really defeat Russia, are they going to launch a World War III that could kill up to tens of millions of people? Tens of millions of people could perish if a war erupts between Russia and the United States. While Brand praises the Ukrainian insurgency, he says Ukraine is running short on weapons and ammunition. Therefore, Western countries face a dilemma of choice between pouring more weapons into Ukraine or husbanding finite capabilities they may need for their own defense. Now, this paragraph is very important, in my opinion, as it seems Western officials and the press is convinced that there is no way back with Russia. It is either a decisive victory for Ukraine over Russia, which is highly unlikely, or direct confrontation with Russia in a war, as I mentioned, tens of millions will perish. So this insistence of sending more weapons, we have to win over Russia. What could it lead to? What are the consequences of this? Are we going to address it now, or let's do it like Syria? Let's now support our allies there against our common enemy, and then we see. In my opinion, this is a short-sighted strategy. Finally, Brand says, don't bet against the world's leading economy and all of its democratic allies in a long war. But don't think that America would effortlessly produce what it needs to win. Therefore, Brand calls for greater investments in the defense industrial base and more aggressive purchasing and stockpiling of key ammunition. He also asks Japan to help the US surge production in shipbuilding and other areas. Now, all the focus of Brand, and not only him, a lot of experts and pundits and journalists nowadays, they focus on only one thing, the military aspect of the war. What about diplomacy, guys? Diplomacy is a continuation of a war with different means. Why aren't we talking about diplomacy as a tool, as a mean to reach to peace, to a lasting peace between Russia and Ukraine first, and between Russia and the Western world also? And behind Russia comes also China. Why aren't we addressing the importance of diplomacy? Look, were the Europeans and the Americans able to stop the nuclear program of Iran through military means? Cyber attacks, threats, sanctions? No. Were they able to halt the nuclear program of Iran through diplomatic means? Yes. So there was a success story. Of course, then Trump came and he deleted the deal, but now they're renegotiating it again. So negotiation is possible between foes because there are no permanent friends and no permanent enemies in politics. Why not using diplomacy? Why only focus on arms shipments and exporting more ammunition and encouraging mercenaries to go to Ukraine? Haven't we learned anything from Syria? Back then, also, they poured Syria with lots of weaponry. They encouraged the multinational jihadists to go to Syria. And what happened? It was the emergence of ISIS, al-Nusra, and other terrorist groups. And these groups threatened the regional security and also international security. And then because of this war, hundreds of thousands of people became refugees. They marched towards Europe, and Europe had to receive over 2 million refugees or so because of the American war. So where is the role of the EU now? Why the EU is so heavily embedded with the American policy, foreign policy? I mean, you can be allies, but at the same time play, for example, a mediation role as a mediator. Why the EU is not mediating between Russia and the United States, for example, over Ukraine, well knowing that this fight is a proxy war between Russia and the United States there. It's very strange to me to see the European Union, like a decade ago, decade or two, they were mediating in places, conflicts like in Lebanon, in Palestine, in elsewhere, in Iraq, and now we don't see the sane voices. We do not hear any sanity coming from European politicians, unfortunately, and it is needed. We need a strong European officials who draw lines between their interests and the American interests, and they try to mediate, use diplomacy. And we need a third way in this, right? This is very unfortunate that we see that all this focus on war machine, etc., and nobody is trying to say enough is enough. Thousands of people perished already in Ukraine. Let's talk. I hope at the end of the day they will realize the harm they caused to the Ukrainian people, and the problem is, as I mentioned, they don't care. I've been your host, Kevork Almassian of Syriana Analysis. If you are new, please consider subscribing and also hit the like button. It really helps me with the algorithm of YouTube as it goes higher in this algorithm that is suppressing the content of alternative channels like mine. And if you want to support Syriana Analysis financially, you can become a patron. Link in the description below, and see you next time.